Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, really glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Garrity is away on his National Review Alaskan cruise, and here in his place once again, Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum and also host of the High Noon podcast. And Inez, we actually have a good martini today. You could even say a double-barreled good martini, which helps to make up a little bit for yesterday. So let's start with the story we're going to camp out on for the most part, and that's that a U.S. District Court judge in Texas has blocked the Biden administration's rewrite of Title IX rules. For those who don't know, Title IX is the landmark federal civil rights law in the United States, was enacted in 1972, and it specifically prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or any other education program that receives funding from the federal government. And the Biden administration, of course, is now torturing the definition of sex to include transgender, gender ideology, gender identity, that sort of thing. And it means not only access to facilities, but participation on sports teams and other activities. I'm sure hotel rooms on field trips. And of course, it would be a major change to the curriculum in some areas if this goes through. And so the court opinion authored by District Judge Reed O'Connor held that the Biden administration abandoned proper procedure by attempting to, quote, functionally rewrite Title IX in a way that shockingly transforms American education and usurps a major question from Congress. That is not how our democratic system functions. Inez, this is good. I know the Independent Women's Forum is on tour right now, pushing for preserving the original intent of Title IX. And this movement got another win yesterday when the body that controls Olympic swimming said that Leah Thomas, the man who swam with the women and won a lot of women's titles at the University of Pennsylvania, cannot participate in the women's division at the Olympics. So what do you make of this opening salvo of what will obviously be a pretty long legal fight over Title IX here?
This is going to be an absolutely critical legal battle, in part because the things you listed are only part of what Biden's Title IX regs actually do. So yes, there's the incorporation of gender identity into the word sex. Yes, all of those implications from bathrooms to locker rooms, sports teams. The Biden administration says they're making a separate rulemaking on sports, but the administration has already filed in federal court saying that Title IX prevents states from making sports women's only. They filed in West Virginia all the way back in 2021 before they had even finalized these regulations. So the Biden administration very, very clearly moving forward with a definition of Title IX and of sex in Title IX that includes basically the notion that any educational institution, and don't forget, this is any educational institution that takes a dime of federal money. So that's from kindergarten all the way up through, medical schools, law schools, right? For treating a boy like a boy and a girl like a girl. That is now discrimination under the Biden administration's interpretation of civil rights law. These are the strongest laws, most far-reaching laws we have on the federal books. So it touches everything. So yes, that has gotten rightly, I think, a lot of the press. But in terms of the legal battle, the Biden administration here has also contravened the Supreme Court definitions of what's necessary for constitutional due process with regard to, for example, the university kangaroo courts about sexual assault. They've contravened federal courts in terms of the limits of freedom of speech and protected speech versus quote unquote harassment, right? Title IX has been long held to include certain prohibitions on sex-based harassment, right? Which the initial thought was, and the case this comes from originally as Davis against Monroe, the initial thought was if you're allowing as a school, for example, a student to follow around a fellow student, a female, whispering sexual things in her ear all day long, at some point that actually prevents her from taking advantage of her education, right? If you're allowing a student to sexually harass another student, day after day after day, going around to all the classes, at some point that student is going to not want to go to class anymore, right? So that was the rationale that this kind of level of sexual harassment was something that schools had a duty to prevent. Right? Otherwise, they were effectively discriminating on the basis of sex in terms of who can actually access the education. But of course, surprise, surprise, that concept has been stretched beyond all belief. We've seen that in the sexual harassment context itself. But in terms of speech, we've also seen it extended to just speech that people don't like or find offensive, right? So whether that's coming from professors or from students, speech that's related, for example, to sex roles, to gender roles, right? To all of the sex wars that we're having, discussions we're having all the time. And of course, in the gender identity context, pronouns, for example, preferred pronouns, right? All of these things are protected speech. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear about what is protected speech, but these regulations contravene the Supreme Court on that. So this is a batch of unelected bureaucrats under Biden who have put forward 1,577 pages of regulation that change the definition of sex in civil rights law, that gut basic due process protections that the Supreme Court and other federal courts have protected over and over and over again with regard to students, and has redefined speech from the way that the federal courts and the Supreme Court have defined it to the way that Biden administration apparatchiks say so, right? So I agree with this court in Texas. This is obviously a major question that's being taken from Congress, right? You don't get to do all of that with the stroke of a pen if you're the Biden administration. You actually, if you want to make it the law of the land, that gender identity is a protected characteristic in civil rights law, you have to go through Congress to do that. In fact, the Democrats have tried to go through Congress to do that. It's called the Equality Act. It's failed every single time it's been brought up because it's incredibly radical and unpopular. So they're just doing it in the backdoor way. And so I'm really pleased to see this, of course, on the substance of Title IX. I think it's disastrous for all the reasons I just laid out, but also on the constitutional structure, right? This is not constitutional governance that we're supposed to have. It's not supposed to be some unelected bureaucrats signing a 1,500-page document that only key stakeholders in D.C. had a chance to weigh in on, right? That's not how we make law or are supposed to make law in this country. This is clearly a major question. This is something that should have gone through the political branches and didn't. So I think this will be, if this ruling is upheld, it'll be a really good precedent, not just on Title IX, but which is itself very, very important because these things we're going to go into effect for the upcoming school year, August 1st, right? So I know that's a lot of information, but it's also going to be a really good ruling, I think, if it continues to be upheld for, you can call it the separation between sort of bureaucrats and law to actually rein in the fourth branch, the administrative state, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. This is an example where they're really, really out on a limb in terms of grabbing powers that are rightfully reserved to the American people. And
I'm glad you brought up the issue about due process in terms of allegations of sexual harassment or assault and that sort of thing. The Obama administration originally put in the rules that really stripped the accused of any sort of due process rights.
And by the way, Joe Biden personally very involved in that as vice president, very much. And it's worth pointing out that he did not apply those standards to himself when he was accused of sexual harassment by Tara Reade, right? That mere accusation, believe all women standard, was not applied to Joe Biden, even though he was very much involved in the first round of these due process stripping regulations under Obama. And now, once again, his administration has reinstituted them.
Joe Biden is always where his party wants him. If you can come up with a spot in 50 plus years of Joe Biden bucking the vast majority of his party, I can't think of one. Well, I've got some more good news for you, and that's making sure you get the nutrients you need every single day. Your mom always told you to eat your vegetables, and she was right. In fact, she might have been more right than she even realized, because that is where you get so many of your core nutrients, and it's hard to get them all just in the normal servings that come with your big meals throughout the day, and you're probably not snacking on veggies too often. And that's where Field of Greens comes in. Field of Greens has spinach, barley, green tea, ginger, turmeric, and other fantastic ingredients in their smoothies. They don't boil them either. They freeze dry them so the nutrients are preserved, and also they're all grown right here. You don't have to wonder what's coming in from China, Mexico, and other places. So don't look back and say, I should have paid attention to nutrition when I was younger. Field of Greens is a key to better health today and when it matters most. To start, Field of Greens will give you 15% off your first order, plus free rush shipping. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use the promo code 3ML. That's promo code 3ML to get 15% off and free shipping at fieldofgreens.com. Fieldofgreens.com. All right, Inez, on to our bad martini now. And our jumping off point here is the Supreme Court decision today as it came to mifepristone. Essentially, the issue remains unresolved on the merits. It was a 9-0 decision on standing of those who brought the case against the FDA. So if they want to come back on this issue, they're going to have to do it in a different way. But as this issue percolates into the headlines again, and we mentioned this yesterday, that one of the things Biden's just going to be beating the drum on over and over and over again, and so will the rest of the Democrats this year, is the issue of abortion. And ever since the Dobbs decision of nearly 2 years ago now, the Democrats have seemed ready for this instantaneously, honestly, and Republicans are almost still shocked that they actually won in the reversal of Roe v. Wade on the Dobbs decision, and they're still trying to find their footing on this. I mean, as soon as this came down, the Democrats made it the hallmark of the midterm elections, which shouldn't surprise you, but they immediately also had constitutional amendments in critical states like Michigan, which really helped Gretchen Whitmer not just win re-election, but win re-election quite comfortably, and Democrats take control of the legislature there and so forth. And Michigan was not the only state where that happened. Now there's a new survey from Gallup showing that a record high 32% of U.S. voters say they would only vote for a candidate for major office who shares their views on abortion. And the importance of a candidate's abortion stance to one's vote is markedly higher among pro-choice voters than it was during the 2020 presidential election cycle, when probably most people didn't think that Roe was going to be struck down. So, and as this kind of ties into also issues Republicans have had in turning out the vote, I know a lot of people were shocked at how close that special House election in a deep red district in Ohio was this week. Republicans still held the seat, but not nearly as much as in previous cycles. And so why is it that the right has failed to really latch onto an issue here? There's infighting about whether the federal government should have some sort of standard, whether it's 15 weeks or something else. Others say it should obviously be to the states. Trump has kind of been groping around trying to figure out where his position is on this. Carrie Lake has had every possible position on this issue, and I'm still not sure what she thinks about it. Democrats seem to obviously be getting a free pass from the media. Most of them are in favor of abortion right up to the moment of birth, even though they claim they're not, and the media tries to provide cover. But Republicans don't seem to have a coherent message, either at the top of the party or anywhere in between. So how big of a problem is that? And are they going to get there in the next few months? I kind of don't think so. I guess
it just depends whether or not it's a problem from what perspective you take. Is it a problem for the Republican Party? Yes. It's obviously a political problem for the Republican Party, right? It's obviously affected elections. It is a key issue. It motivates the leftist base to turn out. And then on the substance itself, like we've had these amendments, some of them quite radical, passing in purple or even red states, right? Where you have pro-abortion amendments in Ohio getting 60, 65 or 70% of the vote, right? So what we're seeing is that people's preferences as reported on polls when this issue was frozen by the Supreme Court are shifting as people actually consider a change from the status quo, which in America, to be clear, the status quo in America pre-Dobbs is one of the most radical in the world in terms of the sort of a liberal stance on when abortion is permitted. I mean, our laws were much more, liberal than most European countries, for example. There are plenty of European countries that have restrictions or bans on abortion after 12 weeks, after 16 weeks, certainly after 20 weeks. So with various exceptions built in. But I do think ultimately this is something that's really good for the body politic. These are muscles that are atrophied. The American public hasn't actually had to politically wrestle in the space where we're supposed to, our democratic system, right, with a serious ethical, moral issue as codified in law for a very long time. I think especially on the right, those muscles are atrophied, which is why you have a lot of people reverting to procedure when they talk about moral issues. They can't actually have a normative moral discussion. Is this good or is it bad? Should we permit it legally? Should we not? Right? And I'm not saying the answers to those questions are simple or easy, but they are part of self-governance. Right? Like you can't separate ethical questions from governance or from the making of law. All law is on some basis, rests on an ethical foundation about what we, the people, think is good or bad, what we think should be encouraged, permitted, or discouraged to the point of criminal law, right? So you can't get away from these kinds of questions. What's happened is those questions have been shunted into the court, or as we talked about last Martini segment, into the administrative state. And that's not only not the constitutional system as designed, but I think it's actually, it strips us of practice in self-government. And I think that's what we're seeing now is this kind of panic with actually having to make a decision. And, it's easy to criticize the Republican Party for panicking since they've been sending out, fundraising emails on this for a very long time. And it's easy to point and laugh at them and say, well, what did you expect? Were you not prepared for this to actually become a political issue? But I think that's a little bit how all of us are. A lot of just ordinary people and voters, they haven't had to really think about what their view on this complicated moral and ethical question is. And now they're thinking through it, right? So I think what we're seeing now is a sort of default to the status quo, which is quite radically liberal. I wouldn't be surprised if over time we actually have that conversation and the position moves more moderate in a direction that the polls showed before Dobbs, right? Where people tend to have a lot more comfort with abortion in the first trimester, for better or worse. They have a lot less comfort with it, in the final trimester. People shake out with various exceptions and so on. But I think that's really what's happening. And I think that process is a good thing for us as Americans, thinking about how to govern ourselves for the first time on a moral question for quite some time. In terms of turnout and the broader question, it is interesting to me that the GOP has, because even 5 or 10 years ago, right, for sure before the Trump era, the Republican Party is very much a party of the voters who were reliable, right? Republican Party voters were those people who were showing up at the polls, a lot of middle class, married couples who, and then seniors who are coming out and you reliably could be relied on to show up for midterm elections, could be relied on to show up for, special elections, right? Whereas the Democratic Party had much more. That's why we had all those get the vote out, rock the vote, whatever, stuff from the Democratic Party, right? Because they were relying on this U-shaped coalition of a small percentage numerically, but very left-leaning elites, right? People who make over, at that time, I think it was over $100,000. Now it's probably with, inflation, it's probably $150,000 or whatever it is. But essentially upper middle class and elite people voted left. But that's a small percentage of the people in America. Then they had sort of the working class. And then on top of that, separate from the working class Americans, people who had very tangential connection to politics, right? People who were very difficult to come out and actually pull the lever, even though they might agree with this issue or that on the Democratic Party. Now, I think it's kind of different in that Trump has brought in a lot of people who were not connected to the political process. They're not your regular midterm voters. They're not your special election voters. They tend to think that both sides suck and the politics is a rigged game, and they're not wholly wrong in any of those assumptions. But those are the people that Trump energized. And so when we talk about turnout for the GOP, and especially in these interim elections, I don't think you can really get away from the question of whether or not Trump is at the top of the ballot, because there are now a substantial number of people attached to the Republican Party whose votes we rely on in presidential elections to, bring the kind of victory that Trump had in 2016. Those people are not broadly attached to the Republican Party, and they're not going to be easy to turn out for a midterm election where Trump is not on the ballot. So, I know the GOP probably sucks at the structural parts of this too, and of showing up at people's doors and ballot harvesting and all the rest. But I do think it's interesting how that dynamic has shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party having or needing the votes of people who are checked out of the political system. And
I think it's fair to point out, I was probably a little too broad in my denunciation of the Republicans not having a plan. There have been quite a few red states who have actually passed very conservative laws on abortion post-Dobbs. I guess it's more on the national level where they've been flailing about whether the federal government still has a role and where they individually land on the issue. Like you said, before Dobbs, you could, put out the campaign email or the campaign position statement on your website and nobody really thought much about it. But nationally, it feels a lot like running on repealing Obamacare, and then 2016 happens and you actually have the opportunity to do it and there's really no consensus on how to do it. And so all this time spent promising to do it and then actually having the chance, it's almost like they never thought they'd be there, so they have never formulated a plan. So maybe I'm being too harsh.
That's a really good analogy. I think that is exactly what's happening, in that people were taking a very strong, simplistic position because they thought they'd never have to deal with it. And then when it came to actually govern, there was a kind of everybody retreating from the position, which I do think, to be clear, I do think it's worth criticizing Republicans for, because they were out there asking for votes on this basis, right? The pro-life bloc is a large part of the Republican Party base, and politicians were promising them certain things for, 30 years. And now that they actually have the opportunity to make those promises actually come to fruition on an issue that obviously matters to that part of the base, they're backing away from it because it's becoming politically unpopular, right? And so I do think that's a very valid criticism to make. I just also think there are a lot of people in the country who are, for the first time, having to really politically think through what they think about abortion morally. And I wouldn't be surprised if that process takes us some more time than like a single election cycle. And
what will happen with the platform this summer? There's some reports out today that that plank might be rewritten, given Trump's nuanced view of the issue now. So how will the base respond to that? Because it's been crystal clear for generations before that.
These jobs reports are just a movie trailer for a bad movie. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. The month of May barely created any full-time jobs, mostly from the government, and tons of part-time jobs. The headline number may look good, but the rest of it is a dud. Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, Inez, crazy martini now, and probably not a huge shock, but turns out that the left loves, quote unquote, democracy. And boy, have they robbed that word of virtually any consistent meaning over the past few years. Basically, anything they don't like is a threat to democracy. My favorite recently domestically is Stacey Abrams saying that if you oppose the institution of DEI policies, you are a threat to democracy. But more recently, it's in response to these EU Parliament elections where far right, quote unquote, parties, and some might be. The Federalist did an interesting story on that, whether it was in France, and now Macron's calling snap elections there for his own political survival, and it's happening in Germany and in many, many other places across the continent. And so this is Raphael Glucksmann, France's lead socialist candidate, who said, everywhere in Europe, we are witnessing a wave that is shaking our democracy. Meanwhile, Columbia University professor Sherry Berman reacted to the results by penning a column for Project Syndicate titled How Serious is Europe's Anti-Democratic Threat?, in which she analyzed whether the rise of right-wing populist parties in Europe represents a threat to democracy. And so when the people vote the way that the left doesn't want to, it's always for far right. And so the definition of that is sliding, just like any position that Joe Biden doesn't like makes you a MAGA extremist in this country. And but my favorite part is that by literally engaging in the democratic process, you're a threat to democracy. So probably not a huge surprise given the way they demagogue the issue. But what do you make of it?
What's being packed into the word democracy is simply absurd. You vote for the wrong candidate and you are responsible for the death of democracy. It seems absurd on its face. I do think there's a very convenient conflation and confusion of the norms of the last 30 years or so. And by norms, I merely mean consensus, that we had a certain sort of post-war, a Cold War consensus, both domestically and abroad. You could even bring it back from even post-World War II. I think we had a kind of consensus from the end of World War II through about the end of the Cold War, and then it starts to fray, but you still have the establishment of both parties in the U.S. and to some extent, I don't know European politics very well, but in Europe as well, sort of ossified into what might be called this neoliberal sort of perspective from both the left and the right for 30 years. And that view had a lot of cracks in it. Both foreign policy, right? We have obviously the very, unpopular and then ultimately failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the U.S. And then in terms of domestic, there are issues that just weren't making it into our politics that under any small d democratic analysis should have, right? Immigration is a huge one, both in Europe and here, that just wasn't breaking into either of the two parties, right? If you remember, one of the first revolts against George W. Bush on the right in 2007 was over his attempt at granting amnesty to illegal aliens and over the immigration issue, right? Because you had a Republican Party under Bush that was in favor of essentially untrammeled immigration, including illegal immigration, because it was good for business to have people coming in large numbers, willing to work for a lower wage. And then on the flip side, in the Democratic Party, you had the rise of this ideological view that everybody has a right to come to the United States because actually U.S. wealth and freedom and success is the result somehow of stepping on the oppressed classes of the world. And you think I'm exaggerating, but that's literally what their view is. And therefore, we owe everybody a piece of the United States, no matter where they come from, because actually our freedom and wealth is illegitimate, right? And then we screwed them somehow, and now we owe them. Okay, so those views did not allow for the immigration issue to even enter into politics. There was no party in America that you could vote for if you were concerned about the effects of either legal or illegal immigration. And that's just one example, but that's how we've mistaken essentially the crumbling of that system, which I think the most direct sense was only around for 30 years, these quote unquote norms, right? But we're seeing if Trump, for example, challenges something that was the consensus view, even something I disagree with him on, like NATO, for example, right? If Trump challenges the view that NATO is a key alliance for the United States, that's somehow undemocratic, or that it's violating the deepest norms of the country. And in order to fight back against that, you have the actual violations of the serious norms of the country, right? Like the fact that generals shouldn't be calling China, to get around the president of the United States, or the fact that our intelligence services shouldn't be spying on a presidential candidate. Like those are real constitutional norms. Those are deep and serious norms, right? I don't know, striking a presidential candidate from the ballot. That's a pretty serious democratic norm, but there's this continual conflation of essentially a consensus that most people, especially in the elite, agreed with for 30 years, showed a lot of cracks, and in the natural sort of evolution of politics is collapsing now. And the conflation of that with quote unquote democracy. I realize that's probably, I realize that, when Joe Biden uses democracy, there's no deeper meaning to it. It's just what Joe Biden doesn't like is anti-democracy, right? But I do think, especially for a lot of the people who are in what we call the deep state, or the people who actually do a lot of the day-to-day governance in the United States, I think what they've demonstrated for the last, 6-7 years at this point is that they will not take democratic correction in terms of the direction of the ship of state from the American people. And I don't think it's actually that dissimilar in Europe. I think it's the same dynamic. It's just obviously complicatedly channeled through parliamentarian systems and stuff that I really don't understand.
Inez, we'll see what we can serve up tomorrow. Thanks for your time today. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. She's also host of the High Noon podcast. And for Jim Garrity today, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us. Please subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Please tell your friends as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us all on X. Inez is at Inez Felcher. Jim is at Jim Garrity. And I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Thursday. And please join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.